Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to the second in our series on effective web conferencing. My name is Sam Anneman in the Center for Teaching and Learning, and I will be your host today. Just before we get started, though, just a couple of little housekeeping issues. So if you have any sound problems, look for the audio button right above the chat area. And check that. If you have any other issues, please call WebEx support, and you can see that number there is 866-229-3239. And if you need to leave the session temporarily, please use the coffee cup button, which is accessed where the little icons are above the chat area. And again, if you have any questions as we're going along, please raise your hand to ask your question via the mic, or you can type any comments and questions into chat. We are recording this session, and we will be sending the link to the recording afterwards. So I'd like to give a brief introduction to our presenter. This particular session is called the Web Presenters Toolkit, and Dr. Bobby Hobgood, the director of the Language Resource Center in the Department of Languages and Cultural Studies, is going to lead the session. So I'm going to turn it over to Bobby, and let's everyone please give him a nice round of applause.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam, and thanks to everyone for being here today for this session. For those of you who are watching this recording, we're sorry that you couldn't be here live because, in fact, this session is about how we take synchronous sessions like this and we use them as a way of engaging participants in the experience versus what all too often happens when you sign up for a web conference or webinar and you find that all that really happens is you're just sitting there listening to a speaker or speakers, and you could have gotten the same experience had you watched a recording. So to begin with, let me first make the distinction between the term web conference and webinar. To be clear, a webinar is more like what I just described, i.e. an experience where you sit and, as we say, sit and get in North Carolina, versus a web conference where there's greater emphasis on interaction between participant and presenter. So having said that, I'm going to move on now, and we'll get started with this session. To reiterate what Sam just said, if at any point in time you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat window, but I will be pausing throughout the session to ask for questions. So if you have a microphone and you would like to pose your question audibly, then please feel free to do so. Okay, let me just do an audio check and make sure everyone can hear me. If I'm coming through loud and clear, would you please click on the check mark that appears above the chat window? Okay, fantastic. How about my video? Are you seeing my video okay? And let me erase your feedback. Give me a check mark if you can see my video right now, okay? All right, fantastic, great. I want to say just a brief word about video. I found in many instances that video isn't necessarily required to engage and keep participants there throughout the session. It can work to your advantage, but it can also work to your disadvantage if you are just a talking head. If you're not very animated, there really is not much calling for a video. So I always do it in every circumstance, at least just to establish my presence so that you can associate a face with the name and with my voice. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn off the video. and we'll focus our attention here on what I call the main stage and go inside the Web Presenters Toolkit. So this particular session for me is born out of my frustration with, as I mentioned earlier, attending web conferences, so I was told, for which I was very excited. And I thought this is going to be a great opportunity to interact with these renowned presenters and speakers. I have the opportunity to ask questions. It will be engaging, only to discover that all I could do was sit there and listen. And it was very, very frustrating. So that experience, coupled with thinking about how we use web conferencing like WebEx in our online or hybrid courses, and wondering how does the speaker or how do the speakers know if the people on the other end, who are in most cases faceless, their names are there, but you don't know necessarily who that person is unless you already have prior acquaintance. How do we know if they're getting it? In other words, how do we know if they understand what's happening? How do we check for that understanding in a web conference? So today I'd like to talk to you a little bit my ideas for you as an online instructor or presenter and how you can check for your participants or students' understanding. So that being said, the learning targets for this session are as follows. I hope that by the end of the session, you'll be able to do these three things. First, to describe three primary stages for creating engagement. Secondly, to integrate one or more techniques to check for understanding. And finally, to identify some best practices for engagement and for checking for understanding. All of these in the web conferencing environment. So, are these okay with everybody? If so, just give me a check mark. That's okay with you? All right, great, fantastic. In terms of how I've organized this session today, there are three components. The first, we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, the stages for engagement. And this is perhaps not new to you if you think about any sort of structured learning experience or structured gathering where there is a knowledgeable other or others, and then a group, a majority who are there to take in, to experience something. And basically it's the before, during, and the after kind of structure that I want to talk about today as it relates to web conferencing. We're also going to talk about checking for understanding and some of the techniques I would recommend and use on a regular basis. In fact, I've been using a couple already. And finally, I always believe as a presenter that I'd be the quintessential hypocrite if I gave a number of presentations about this sort of thing and I don't myself model what I'm talking about. So I want to model for you today some of these best practices that I use when I conduct presentations like this or when I'm meeting with my class. So one of the first strategies that Sam already kind of conducted for us here was to establish a protocol and etiquette for the session. I like to send out that information in advance to my students via an email, but if you don't do that, I think it's a great idea on the opening slide when participants enter your room to have this kind of information present. So you see here on the right-hand side of the screen this bulleted list of directions that indicate to the participant how they will interact and ask questions during the session. And then on the left-hand side of the screen here under the header, remember some other guidelines, some etiquette for participants. Things like, when you do talk, make sure you stay on topic, respect others' ideas, and some of the same expectations we would have in a face-to-face setting. But in particular, you may want to highlight these last two, signaling that if you want to use your microphone to ask a question, it would be good if you clicked on the raised hand icon to indicate as such. And then this other one here, I think a lot of folks are excited that they can type in the chat window, especially if they see friends or acquaintances, but they forget for one reason or another that number one, everybody else can see what they're typing, and number two, this session will be recorded. So what does that mean, if they lose sight of where they are? So a great way of establishing some guidelines for interaction is to begin by sharing these sorts of protocol and etiquette with participants. Okay, so I'm already ready to stop because I've been talking for quite a bit. And if you've ever led a session like this before, it can be a little awkward when you're sitting there in a room talking and nobody's talking back to you. It's an experience that takes some getting used to be honest. So I like to pause a little early in the session to do two things. Number one, to make sure that everyone can hear me. And you notice that I did that before I really started talking about the content. And then number two, I want to pause early on to make sure that everyone is with me, to give people the opportunity to say, hey, I totally missed this important piece, or Bobby, can you slow down? You're going way too fast for me. So I'm going to stop right now and see if there are any questions thus far. Okay, Concepcion gives me a red X, so I'm taking that no, she's good. And Karen, you're okay? Okay, fantastic. So I would also be hypocritical if I did not mention early in my presentation, especially in a session like this, that it is too easy, I think, to let technology drive what we do. We are bombarded today by technology in so many areas of our lives. And in education, there have been a lot of folks who jumped on a number of technology bandwagons to bring technology into the classroom or into our workspaces. However, there is a real danger, as you probably all know, from doing so, because what I've experienced and what I've seen firsthand here at the university, also around the state and around the nation, is folks who invest a lot of money in technologies and they end up becoming a slave to the technology and not the other way around. So I would encourage you to always think first and foremost about your goals or your objectives for any kind of experience, whether it's a classroom experience, a web conference like this, a presentation. What are your objectives and goals? And then after you've taken stock of those things, one of the last decisions you ought to be is, okay, now what technologies are available to me, and to what extent can they enhance or extend what I'm going to do with my pre-established goals. I'd mentioned to you that in terms of engaging participants, there are three stages I like to focus on: the before, the during, and the after. So let's take a look at that first stage, which I also talk about as developing the web conference. So again, to say what I mentioned just a moment ago, it's important to establish the learning targets for your session and to make those visible to your participants from the very beginning. If you look at both pedagogy and andragogy, you know that both younger learners as well as older learners appreciate knowing what's going to happen during the next 45 minutes to an hour. So I think it's very important that you let them know up front, here are the things that we're going to focus on. I've designed this experience to help you achieve these things, and to write those in language that's very digestible, meaning that easily understood upon first reading it, and also actionable, making sure that if you write something as a learning target for your session, that your participants actually can act upon it. In terms of setting up your content during your developing stage, as you're planning it out, one approach is to think about developing that presentation in three parts. The first part might be the whys and the whats of your presentation. then followed by the how of the presentation, and then finally resolving that former question by saying, okay, now what? Okay, so now that I've presented this challenge to you, this problem, and I've given you some ideas and developed the how, here's where we go from here. So in my planning stages of sessions like this, I start out with a why and a what, and then work on the development piece, and then I always like to end with a so what, where do we go from here? Okay. I also recommend that in the planning stage, you create some guidelines to check for understanding. So if you know during the planning stage, hey, I need to periodically check in with my participants and see what they understand, you build those in, then you're certainly more likely to observe those throughout the session. So here are some suggestions I have for you. First of all, consider who your audience is and how much attention they're going to need, maybe how soon you have to check for understanding or how often you need to check for understanding. Think about a variety of ways to prompt participants, but don't go overboard. So don't feel like you have to use every single technique in the book, but just a couple of techniques for prompting them. So for example, perhaps the most easiest way to check for understanding is simply to verbally pose a question and ask participants to respond in a particular way. And I've done that for you already by asking you to click the check mark, and I might also ask you, well, could you type a response in the chat window? So think about using at least 2 different ways to prompt participants and solicit feedback from them. Okay. The other thing that I've already demonstrated is to plan in your slides. If you're going to use a series of slides, to insert an any question sort of slide throughout the session, which if nothing else is certainly a bold reminder to you, the presenter, that you need to stop and check for understanding and ask questions. Similar to number B, vary the way that you pose questions, whether you ask some very factual sorts of questions or open-ended questions, different types of questions. Think about the variety of questions that you pose, and to the extent that they engage participants beyond simple knowledge or factual recall, but rather require them to maybe synthesize and put 2 and 2 together, as we say. I think about this particularly in terms of the course I'm teaching this semester online, which is Advanced Foreign Language Methods. And in such sessions, while I want to make sure my students are aware of certain methods and theories and practices, at the same time, I like to provide them with case studies that really require them to think at a higher level. Also, in terms of designing your presentation to check for understanding, one consideration is, as you're putting together slides like I've done here, to keep in mind that we might have a lot of fun creating very complex and interesting sorts of slides that we consider to be clever, but in the long run, simple and clear trumps clever but complex, meaning that if it takes a lot of energy and effort to figure out what's going on with the slide, but your intent is just to communicate a simple, straightforward message, then maybe you need to kind of back up on the slide and edit a little bit. And then finally in this list, I would encourage you to develop some sort of script or bulleted notes for yourself. In this case, I provided, my script is the same information I'm sharing with you, and I have to confess that I worry sometimes that we fall into this trap of using our slides always as our script rather than slides being a support for what we have to say. In this case, I've made an exception because I'm giving you a checklist and kind of talking through with you these strategies. So to that end, I'm okay with doing that. But as a presenter for yourself, I would encourage you, if you don't have it on a slide here, to maybe have at your desk somewhere a script and at least some bulleted notes. Because if they're not seeing your face all the time, then you're going to have to really engage consistently through your voice. If you have not prepared adequately, I don't care how engaging your voice is, that's going to come through. Here is an activity that I use consistently in web conferencing to engage participants, and this is something that I built in to my set of slides, and it's an opportunity for you to experience a technique for engaging participants. So based on what we have heard thus far, and based on your own experiences, I'm going to ask you if you would share with us, using the whiteboard, a technique or some techniques to prepare participants for interaction. Okay, so here's how this works. You'll notice in the whiteboard at the top of the screen, you see a number of tools, and one of those tools is the letter T. That's the text tool. If you click on that, it then will allow you to click anywhere on the whiteboard. So I'm going to ask you to type a suggestion for how you prepare participants for interaction in a web conference. I'm going to ask if you would share your suggestion by using that text tool and clicking in the appropriate quadrant that corresponds to your birth month. So for example, I'm born in the month of October. So I'm going to click that letter T there at in the toolbar. Then I'm going to click in the bottom right corner, the quadrant that has the header October, November, December. And I'm going to type an idea or suggestion for preparing participants for interaction. I might say something like sending out a pre-conference email. Okay, so now you can see there's my suggestion there in that quadrant. So let's just take a minute or so for those of you in the group to share a suggestion. How would you prepare participants for interaction? Great. So someone said have them do a task prior. I love that. Fantastic. Any other ideas? Okay, so here's another one. Haven't done a web conference, but in face-to-face classes, ask them to write a response before I ask them to share with the rest of the class. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so before you as the instructor are sharing something with the entire class, you ask students to write that down for themselves. Fantastic. I like that. Okay. This is one strategy here, this technique, and obviously I built this into my set of slides, my slide deck. So I have that available, and because I use this on a repeated basis with my students, once I explain how it works the first time, when they see it again, they know immediately what to do. So today it may seem like I spent a lot of time explaining how this works. The next time, boom, if you were in my class, you know right away where to go with this. Okay? All right. So to add to the fantastic suggestions we just saw in the previous slide, in terms of preparing participants for interaction in the experience, as we saw already, make sure you establish web conference etiquette. And with students, I like to send that out in advance. Inform them of what they are allowed to do in advance. For example, you might say to them, in our upcoming session, you won't be using the webcam. You'll instead be using the microphone and the chat window. Make sure they understand clearly why they're having the web conference, what's the focus of the web conference, and maybe, as someone suggested, engage them in some pre-conference activity first, maybe a pairs activity or some sort of personal independent work before the experience. This one right here, you know, we can all do this, but there's still going to be glitches, and that is we can ask participants to perform a computer check prior to coming online, meaning making sure that their microphone is working, their webcam is working, if they're going to be using that, so that we minimize any glitches during the session. You can do that, but be prepared for the fact that despite participants doing that, there's still going to be those glitches. And then one expression I love is engage them before you engage them. And that is to think about how to create a roundtable feel during the event. Okay, so what can you do prior to the event to engage them? How can you create an environment where they know that they're going to be sitting more or less at a table with you, though that table might be spread geographically across great distances, but you're all coming to sit at this one table. What are the things that you could do to kind of emulate that idea of, you know, we're all sitting around this one table even though we're in different places. And then the other thing you might do is before you have a formal event, let's say you're having a guest speaker come into an online class that you're teaching, or a guest speaker who's coming into a face-to-face class, and you're using WebEx or another web conferencing platform. Give your students the opportunity to first practice using the features and the layout of the platform before that formal experience, so that they're comfortable with how things work. They know how they'll be able to interact before the experience begins. And then for yourself, I highly recommend, and Sam has always been gracious to help me out with this, and that is to conduct a technical rehearsal. In other words, log into the space ahead of time and upload slides if you have them, practice sharing your desktop if you're going to do so. Here you see a photo of my office, a web conference that I delivered last year, and my practice. So you see that I had my webcam was ready to go, and you'll notice that I also had a laptop on the other side of the desk here. I will use that, and I sometimes will log in so that I can see things from the participant perspective. Or I might use my laptop for some notes. But it's always good to make sure your space is ready and to conduct a technical rehearsal in advance. Okay, so again, I realize that we've covered a lot of ground here as we look at how you can prepare for a web conference, preparing participants for engagement. So I want to stop here and see if there are any questions, and would love to have you pose a question via your microphone if you're so inclined. Okay, Concepcion says no questions there. Karen, any questions on your end? Okay, all right then, fantastic. All right, with your permission then, I'm going to continue on, and we're going to now look at stage 2. So what are the things that you can do during the web conference, i.e. conducting the web conference? And as you would imagine, there's going to be a little crossover here because we've already talked about in the planning stage what we can plan for. Now we'll talk about what does this look like actually during the web conference. So Sam always does this when he hosts web conferences like this, and that is to conduct an audio check at the very beginning to make sure that everyone is hearing things. I mean, can you imagine that would really defeat the purpose, wouldn't it, if you logged in and you couldn't hear a thing? So Sam asked you if you were able to hear. If you had a microphone, you could click on the microphone and say, hello, I'm hearing you okay. Or another technique, if you're not requiring participants to have a mic, is to ask them to signify their ability to hear by maybe clicking on a smiley face or some other icon to indicate that the sound is coming through okay. I always ask my students to log in 15 minutes prior to sessions. And inevitably, I do so, and if they don't hear anything, even though they see participants in the room, they assume nothing's happening. And they're worried that there's a problem. So another technique in addition to the audio check, a twist on the audio check is I will actually create a slide that says I will conduct an audio check every 5 minutes prior to the start of the session. So at 1:15, hopefully a number of them have logged in. I might say, hello, welcome to the space. This is the first of 3 audio checks prior to the start of our session. Between times, you will hear silence. And then 5 minutes later, I'll repeat that same broadcast message. So that's another way for me to ensure that once we reach the time to start the web conference, everyone can hear, everyone is set and ready to go. Again, during the session at the very beginning, Sam created that nice slide with the protocol, giving you insight into the ways in which you can speak, you can be recognized to ask questions, you can respond yes or no to share your emotions, or to type out something a little more detailed by using the chat box. Okay. Sam also talked about question protocol, and I was also very deliberate in terms of how I wanted to handle questions. In fact, I told you that throughout the session I would stop and handle questions. And I mentioned that I'm happy for you to ask questions via chat, via audio. I didn't mention video. Of course, I wouldn't be opposed if someone wanted to do so, or if maybe you sent questions directly to the moderator. And in some instances, you won't see in a chat window, for instance, in some platforms, everyone's questions, but rather there's a Q&A box that you might type a question in, and then the moderator might feed those questions onto the presenter. So if you plan for engagement and interactivity, address at the beginning of the session the protocol for asking questions. Also, and this is somewhat redundant for the first slide, but make sure you remind participants how to interact during the session. If you're using polling tools, and we won't do so today, but if you are, make sure that they understand that they'll be interacting with the polling feature, how they'll use icons, the polling tools, the chat feature, and the audio tools. Another technique for polling participants that involves the whiteboard is a technique that I absolutely love, and I find that engages participants quite a bit, and that is to, in the planning process, so you're planning for engagement, you create a slide that looks like this, and it's a representation, somewhat of a Likert scale, where you spell out a continuum, and on the left-hand side here, we're talking about how much a person uses social media, the extent to which. And so the far left is, I don't get it. I don't use it at all. And then a little further along is, well, I check in once in a while. And even further, perhaps you might say, well, I actively engage in the use of social media. I access Twitter every day. I have a Twitter app on my phone. And then the far right end is that I engage, I create content, and I drive discussions. So I'm going to ask you now, if you would, using, again, the whiteboard tools at the top of the page, you'll notice that you have, it's 5 icons from the left. You have a tool that is the pencil tool, and you can change the color of that pencil. And so I'm going to ask you, if you would, to click on that pencil and then just kind of maybe draw a circle on this continuum that best represents the extent to which you use social media. Okay, so for me, I'm going to click on the pen. I use the highlighter here, and I'm going to choose this burgundy color, and I'm going to put myself right about there. Okay. So you see here, this is I think a fun way for participants to respond, and it's a different type of polling, but a way for everybody to see the results right away. So I'm going to give myself a big smiley face on that one because I like it. I think it's really cool. Yep. Okay. Sam Enneman, noticed in the chat box, says that he is an active social media user. Congrats, Sam. I think you and I are in good company. At this point, I want to pause, and I want to see if there are any questions about strategies you might use during the presentation. Okay, no, we're good. Okay, let's continue on and explore just a little bit further this idea of how we engage during the session. One of the mistakes that I think we all make as novice presenters in a web conferencing platform is not allowing time for transitions. And by that I mean keeping in mind that I'm assuming today all of us in this room are here on campus or we're in a place where we have a relatively high connectivity speed to the web, to the internet. So we've got great bandwidth. But remember that even with bandwidth, good bandwidth, our actions within this web conferencing platform are going from your end through the web, and then they have to be processed on the other end for everybody else. So keep in mind when you transition perhaps from one slide to another slide, when you share your desktop, for instance, so if you go from showing slides to sharing your desktop, or when you ask participants to type something in the chat window, to use whiteboard tools, you have to allow for time for those transitions to take place. So you might even say, here's what you're going to do, and I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to pause for about 10, 20 seconds while you do this because you want to make sure that you've given everyone ample time to locate the tools on the interface that they're going to use, and you also want to allow for any differences in bandwidth. Sam, please chime in here, but I think that the bandwidth issues are becoming less and less of a challenge and a problem. Would you agree with that, Sam?
Yes, in general, I would say that's true, although, there are still parts even of this state, I'm thinking particularly in the eastern and western ends of the state where not everyone has a high-speed connection even today.
Yeah. I think that's a very good point. And, I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm actually meeting in a web conference tonight via Canvas with my online class. And one of my students is in Paris. Now, unfortunately, she can't join us because we're starting at 6 and it will be midnight her time. But when we do meet at another time, I'll have to take into consideration any kind of drag that would be caused by, her being, across the big bathtub, as they say. But then Sam also raises the point that here in North Carolina, we may have students who are participating with us from other parts of the state where perhaps their connectivity is not as great. So make sure you allow for those transitions. Another thing that I believe I've demonstrated today is to narrate what participants can't see. And by that, I mean, if you have to, as the presenter, spend a moment or two changing the configurations of the interface on your end so that you can maybe share your desktop or open up a feature for participants, rather than having a lot of that dead time, it's useful if you can narrate what's going on. And it may seem a little silly to you. It's kind of like, your internal voice is, okay, now I need to go get a cup of coffee, or boy, I'm really thirsty. But in a situation like this, it's important that you do so that participants don't automatically assume, oh my, there's a problem, I've lost connectivity, what's going on here? The reality today of using technology is that I think we've all become acculturated to the fact that if we don't get a response from a mouse click within a millisecond, or if there's dead silence in a web conference like this that lasts for more than 2 seconds, there's a problem. Okay, so consider if you are going to be reconfiguring something, or if you have to pause for a minute, how you can narrate or at least let participants know what's going on so they don't assume that things have stopped working. Another technique is, especially in a presentation like this that's going on for an amount of time, is to consider referencing milestone topics or providing some mini summaries. So at the end of each of these sections, I might say, okay, well, we just finished talking about strategies we would use to plan for those checks for understanding and plan for engagement prior to a web conference. Now we're moving on to this piece. So again, thinking about how you can reference where you are in the presentation, maybe even as you've seen me do here, I've used some what I call topic or section slides, which are those black slides that spell out the focus of the upcoming section. Okay, and then think about also during the session, if you launch a poll or if you have a Q&A, making sure that you don't just display those polls or just let them go, but there's a reason why you have a poll. There's a reason why you're asking for that Q&A, and so making sure that you recognize the results by summarizing those or discussing them. So you might say, well, the results of this poll indicate to me this, or based on your responses in the chat right now, I can see that many of you feel this way. So don't simply assume that by virtue of people being able to read that they are going to read, but actually think aloud and recognize and summarize the results of those activities. Okay. The other thing you might do is to also revisit your learning targets. So at the beginning of the session, you established some learning targets. One of them was describing 3 stages for creating engagement. So I might ask you, okay, please click the check mark if you feel like you can talk about at least 2 of those stages. And you could list a couple of strategies that you need to use at the beginning. So yeah, it's a good idea to revisit those learning targets. I think about what we do in education. We often will start out sharing learning targets, but then do we ever go back and revisit them to actually, say to our participants, okay, here were the learning targets I presented to you. Where are you with respect to these? Do you feel like you can do these things? Okay, so now we just finished talking about those strategies to check for understanding and engage participants during the web conference. We're on now to that third and final phase, which I refer to as connecting. So connecting what happened during the web conference with what happens beyond this point in time. Okay, so if we're talking about a class, I would certainly send out a follow-up email to participants, to your students. You might even include some sort of a handout or resource relative to what happened during the session. But that's a way to kind of help students revisit or help participants revisit what happened during the session. In many cases, you may want to make your notes, your slides available to participants, particularly if there's a lot of very significant content on those slides. You want to think about also how you're connecting your web conference to independent practice. So one thing I like to do is during the web conference, I actually will create an activity that sets them up for some independent practice. So I will tell them, okay, we're going to engage in this content today. And maybe the content today is learning how to plan for a web conference. And so maybe your independent practice, if we were in an online course together, might be to sit down and to start preparing those materials for an upcoming web conference. So I might say to you, okay, students, I want you to, based on what you saw today, send me your outline. What are the steps that you're going to go through to prepare for that web conference? So I've tied what happens during the web conference to what they're going to do during independent practice. Okay, so in summary today, I think it's important to minimize participant anxiety and minimize a lot of technical, potential technical problems in a web conference by talking about support tools and providing information up front. I also think it's important for us in terms of making sure participants get the most out of sessions, that we model web conference tools and behaviors for them, that we design and we integrate intermittent checks for understanding during our web conferences, and that we think about how we connect web conferences to what students, or if you want to change the word students to participants, to something that they're going to do after the fact. So I want to pause now and see, we talked about these 3 stages, and I kind of gave you a summary here. If there are any questions about anything I've shared with you today. Okay, well, I'm going to take it, Concepcion and Karen, that I'm a genius, that I've done a great job based on your feedback here, that you have no questions. I hope this information was clear for you, and that I will conclude this session and then turn it back over to Sam. And I really want to thank the both of you for being here today, and for anyone who watched this session as a recording. I hope that the structure of this session, the modeling of the session, the information gave you some insight in how you can check for understanding with participants while at the same time engaging them in a web conference. So Sam, I'll turn this thing back over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Bobby. Let's give Bobby a nice round of applause for an excellent presentation. And I would just like to point out we have a few upcoming webinars. Tomorrow, one on giving effective written feedback in Canvas, and next week, the second in our series of the Student's Pathway to Success, a faculty guide. This was on constructing a course syllabus. That was a project where CTL helped some faculty actually write a guidebook, an online guidebook for faculty. But most importantly, I would like to remind everybody that on April the 12th, Bobby will be back with a third in this series on web conferencing, on presentation materials that pop. And there is the link. You can sign up for it now. And so we hope to see you then. And finally, before we wrap up, I would just like to offer everyone, since we're kind of the middle of the afternoon, your opportunity to have a nice chocolatey dessert. These are actual real desserts from a shop that I found at a conference in Vancouver that was called rightly, Death by Chocolate. So maybe if you would just indicate either on the slide or in the chat, what is your favorite dessert there? And Karen, I see your hand is up. So if you have a question, please go ahead. I'll unmute your mic and feel free. Did you have a question, Karen?
Sam, I noticed Karen actually put her question there in the chat box.
Okay, because I'm not seeing it. I don't know where she put it. Not to all participants. So.
Oh, that's bizarre. I'm seeing it. Her question was, does CTL offer training to help instructors understand how to use all the tools?
Yes, we do. We tend to offer them near the beginning of a semester or near the end of a semester, getting ready for a new semester. So we will be offering some WebEx workshops, probably not again until April and May at this point. And I'm sorry I missed that that question down in the chat. So in the chat, the best thing to do is from that send to, if you just select all participants, that will make sure that everybody will see your chat messages. But I want to thank you, and again, thank Bobby for a great presentation, and we look forward to seeing you at future webinars. So thanks again.